The first time my uncle smiled after Grandma died, it wasn't at the funeral. It was 3 days later, standing in her living room, looking at the empty space above the fireplace where her framed photograph used to hang. He smiled like someone who had already counted the money. What he didn't know was that Grandma had already counted him and left instructions for exactly what would happen next. I didn't understand that at the time, not even close. If you're watching this, you probably already know these kinds of stories don't start with courtrooms or lawyers. They start in quiet houses, the kind that feel slightly too still, even when people are inside them. Before everything happened, Grandma's house was just that kind of place. 2 floors, old brick, a front gate that stuck every winter and made a sound like metal complaining. It sat in a neighborhood that hadn't changed much in 30 years, except for the cars getting newer and the people becoming more impatient. That house was where I spent most of my childhood weekends, and later, where I learned what patience actually costs. My grandmother was the kind of person people described as quiet, but never in a way that meant she was weak. She noticed everything: the way people stood when they lied, the way they avoided eye contact when they were calculating something, the way they suddenly became affectionate when inheritance got mentioned, even indirectly. She never called it out, she just remembered, and wrote things down, always in that small leather notebook she kept in her kitchen drawer, the same drawer where she kept tea bags, rubber bands, and old receipts she never threw away. I used to think she just liked keeping order. I understand now. She was keeping evidence. My uncle, on the other hand, believed loudness was the same thing as authority. He was my father's older brother. Big voice, expensive watch he couldn't quite afford, always arriving slightly too late to family events, but acting like his presence completed them. He had 2 moods: charm when he needed something, and irritation when he didn't get it. Grandma never said she disliked him, she just stopped answering his calls as often. That was her way of speaking. Silence carefully placed. The house itself meant different things to different people. To my uncle, it was prime property. He said that phrase once at a family dinner when Grandma was still alive. Prime property. He said it while looking at the walls, not at her. I remember the pause that followed. Grandma slowly placed her spoon down, not angry, just aware. And then she changed the subject to the weather. But after that night, she started locking her bedroom door. Even during the day, that was new. I was the only one who visited her regularly, not because I was especially noble. It was simpler than that. She liked routine. I liked silence. So I would come every Saturday morning, bring groceries, fix small things she never asked anyone else to fix. A leaking tap, a flickering hallway light, a door hinge that made a sound like it was tired. She never said thank you more than once. She didn't believe in repetition for things that were already understood. Instead, she would just slide a cup of tea across the table and sit across from me without speaking for long stretches of time. Those silences were never uncomfortable. They felt structured, like something was being arranged without words. I didn't realize it then, but she was studying me in the same way she studied everyone else, just more gently. The last year before she passed, something changed in her routine. She started asking small, precise questions, not emotional ones, practical ones. How long does it take for paperwork to be finalized after someone dies? Do lawyers usually read wills aloud, or do they just summarize them? If someone wanted to make sure a decision couldn't be challenged, what would they need to do? At the time, I thought it was just curiosity. Old people sometimes think about these things, but she never asked anything without a reason. I just didn't know the reason yet. My uncle started visiting more around the same time, but only when she was unwell. He would arrive with fruit baskets, expensive ones, wrapped too neatly to feel natural. He would sit at her bedside and talk about family responsibility, about making things fair, about how no one should be left out. Grandma would listen without responding. Then she would ask him if he had checked on his own children lately. That usually ended the conversation. The day she fell seriously ill, I was called before anyone else, not my uncle, not other relatives, me. I found her sitting in her armchair by the window. The light outside was soft, almost gray. She looked smaller than I remembered, not weaker, just condensed, like all unnecessary space had been removed from her. She didn't ask for help right away. Instead, she pointed to the kitchen drawer, the one with the notebook, and said one sentence I didn't fully understand at the time. "Don't let them talk you out of what I decided." Then she closed her eyes like the conversation was already over. I remember asking her what she meant. She didn't answer. She just repeated something she had said many times before, in different forms. People only argue when they think something belongs to them. That was the last complete conversation I had with her while she was fully awake. 2 days later, she passed away quietly in her sleep. No dramatic moment. No final speech, just absence. The kind that fills a house faster than sound ever could. And that was when everything started. Because within hours of her death, my uncle was already making calls, not to check on me, not to arrange the funeral, but to ask one question: what exactly did she leave behind? At the time, I didn't think much of it. I thought grief made people behave strangely. I was wrong. He wasn't grieving, he was calculating. And somewhere in that same house, hidden behind legal language I hadn't seen yet, Grandma had already accounted for every calculation he was about to make. I didn't understand what was happening until the lawyer placed the envelope on the table. It was a plain manila folder. No branding. No decoration. Just my grandmother's name typed neatly across the front in black ink. It looked ordinary. That was the first unsettling detail. Nothing about Grandma was ever careless. So if something looked simple, it usually wasn't. The lawyer's office was quiet in a way that felt intentional. Thick carpet, bookshelves that looked more for credibility than use, a clock on the wall that ticked slightly too loudly, as if reminding everyone that time was still moving, even when people wished it wouldn't. My uncle sat across from me without looking at me. He hadn't spoken much since we arrived, but he didn't need to. He had already decided how this meeting would end. That much was obvious. He kept adjusting his cufflinks, not because they were crooked, but because he needed his hands to be doing something that looked important. The lawyer finally opened the folder. He didn't rush. He read like someone who had already seen the ending but was required to confirm it line by line. Then he spoke. "Your grandmother's will is very specific." My uncle leaned forward immediately. That word specific seemed to comfort him. Specific meant controllable. He nodded like he was ready to negotiate with paper, but the lawyer didn't return the expression. Instead, he turned a page, and the room changed. "She left the house," the lawyer said, "to her grandson." For a moment, I didn't process it. It felt like hearing your name called in a place you weren't expecting to be chosen. My uncle froze. Not fully shocked, more like interrupted mid-thought. Then he let out a small breath through his nose. Not a laugh, something closer to disbelief trying to disguise itself as confidence. "There must be a mistake," he said immediately. The lawyer shook his head once. "No mistake." And then he added something that changed the temperature in the room. "The will includes a no contest clause." I had heard the term before, but only vaguely. The lawyer saw my confusion and leaned back slightly. He explained it carefully, like he had done this many times, but still respected how heavy the words could become. "A no contest clause means that if any beneficiary challenges the will in court and loses, they forfeit anything they were otherwise entitled to receive." He paused, then looked directly at my uncle. "In simpler terms, if you sue and fail, you lose your share entirely." The silence after that wasn't empty. It was loaded. My uncle smiled again, but this time it didn't reach his eyes. "That's not enforceable," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a habit, a reflex of someone used to reality adjusting itself around his expectations. The lawyer didn't respond immediately. He just placed another document on top of the folder, a signed amendment, witnessed, notarized, dated, months before Grandma died. I noticed something then. The date wasn't recent. It wasn't done in urgency. It was done in preparation. She anticipated this, the lawyer said quietly, and for the first time, something in his tone changed. Not sympathy, respect. My uncle leaned back in his chair. For the first time, he didn't look comfortable, not because he had lost, but because he hadn't yet understood how. On the drive back, he didn't speak. The city passed outside the window in a blur of movement that felt disconnected from what had just happened inside that office. When we stopped at a traffic light, he finally said something. "She manipulated you," he said. "Not me, her." Like she was still in the room and still accountable. I didn't respond, because I wasn't sure what he meant, or what part of the situation he thought had been manipulated. The documents were clear. The signatures were real. And Grandma had been many things, but impulsive wasn't one of them. That night, I went back to her house alone. The front gate still stuck the same way. The hallway still smelled faintly of old wood and lavender polish. Everything was exactly as she left it. Except now it felt different, like the house was waiting, not grieving, waiting. I found the small leather notebook in the kitchen drawer, the same one she always kept, but this time, I didn't just glance at it, I read. Not everything made sense immediately. Some entries were financial, some were names, some were short sentences that felt meaningless on their own. But one line stopped me. It was written months before she died. If they contest, they confirm everything I already know. I read it again, then again, and that was the moment I realized something I hadn't understood before. This wasn't just a will. It was a sequence, a trigger, and my uncle had just taken the first step exactly where she expected him to. The next morning, I got the call. My uncle had hired lawyers, not to understand the will. To challenge it. He was confident it would be overturned. He told relatives I had influenced her. He said the house had been redirected unfairly. He even suggested she wasn't fully mentally stable in her final months. Each accusation arrived like a piece of a strategy. Not grief, not confusion. Strategy. But what he didn't know yet was that Grandma never relied on just one layer of protection. The will was only the beginning, and buried beneath it quiet, deliberate, and documented over years was something far more dangerous than he had prepared for. Evidence, not of intent, but of foresight, and every piece of it had already been waiting for him to act. The first hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning that felt too ordinary for what it carried. Outside the courthouse, people moved the same way they always do, coffee in hand, phones half raised, conversations already halfway gone before they finished speaking. Inside, everything slowed down, not emotionally, structurally, like the building itself refused to rush truth. My uncle arrived before I did. I saw him through the glass doors as I entered. Dark suit, perfect posture, that same expensive watch catching the light when he checked the time. He looked calm, not because he was confident in truth, because he was confident in pressure. That had always been his method. If something resisted him, he increased force until it stopped resisting. Inside the courtroom, the air felt filtered, controlled. Every sound slightly softened by wooden distance. The judge sat above everything with the kind of expression that didn't reveal anticipation or boredom, just attention. That was worse. Attention meant nothing would be missed. My uncle's lawyer spoke first. He used words like concern, irregularity, and potential undue influence. None of them were direct accusations. They were shaped like suggestions, the kind meant to slowly settle into a listener's mind and begin sounding like memory. He implied I had isolated Grandma. He implied she had been vulnerable. He implied the will was not her true intention. My uncle didn't look at me while this was said. He didn't need to. He was already living inside the version of events he preferred. When my lawyer stood, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply placed a stack of documents on the desk, not dramatically, carefully, like placing something fragile that could still cut if handled wrong. The first was the will. The second was the codicil. The third was something my uncle hadn't seen yet. Your Honor, my lawyer said, this estate was not assembled in haste. It was structured over several years with consistent documentation and independent witnesses. He paused just long enough for the words to settle, then added, the decedent anticipated exactly this dispute. That phrase changed the room. My uncle shifted slightly in his seat, not visibly uncomfortable, but no longer still. Then the evidence began. Not all at once, in sequence, each piece building on the last like steps that led somewhere already mapped. First, handwritten notes from Grandma's notebook, dated entries referencing conversations that had taken place with my uncle years earlier. Not emotional descriptions, observations, statements like, he confuses agreement with ownership, and, he believes persistence changes legality. My uncle's lawyer objected quietly. It didn't matter. The judge allowed it in. Then came emails. Printed. Verified. In them, Grandma had contacted the estate attorney months apart, asking precise questions about how to protect a beneficiary from coercion after death. Not naming my uncle directly, never naming anyone, just describing behavior patterns. The lawyer paused before reading one line aloud. It said, if challenged, the truth should not need defending. It should already be recorded. My uncle leaned forward slightly at that point. Just slightly, like someone beginning to realize the room was not reacting the way he expected. Then the most difficult piece arrived, a recorded conversation, legally obtained. My uncle's voice first, not in court, but from a visit to Grandma's house months before she passed. He was speaking to her about fair distribution, about how the house should stay in the family name, about how decisions should be revisited while she was still sharp enough. There was a pause in the recording, then Grandma's voice. Calm, measured, not angry, just final. I have already decided, she said, and after a short silence, you are only here to confirm what you think you can change. The courtroom didn't react outwardly, but something shifted anyway. It always does at that point. When people realize the person they underestimated was recording the entire time, not with devices, with structure, with documentation, with foresight. My uncle's lawyer tried to argue that the recording was taken out of context, but then the next piece was introduced. A signed statement from a neighbor, confirming repeated visits, confirming my uncle's pressure, confirming that he had, in more than one instance, tried to discuss future ownership while Grandma was still alive. The neighbor described it simply. He spoke about the house like she had already agreed. Then came the medical notes, not dramatic, just clinical, stating Grandma was fully competent, mentally consistent, aware of all estate decisions. No indication of incapacity. Each line quietly dismantled the argument that she had been vulnerable. My uncle finally looked at me then, not with anger, not yet, with disbelief that had begun to lose structure, like something inside him was trying to adjust to a reality it hadn't planned for. Then my lawyer spoke again. This is not a case of confusion, he said. This is a case of intent documented, witnessed, and repeatedly confirmed. He turned slightly toward the judge, and the decedent included a no contest clause specifically to address what we are witnessing now. That was the first time the word clause felt like something physical, not language, mechanism. The judge called for a brief recess. When court resumed, the atmosphere had changed, not louder, final, like a decision had already begun forming in silence. The ruling came shortly after. The judge reviewed the filings, the evidence. The clause, then spoke without hesitation. The challenge lacks sufficient grounds to overturn the will. A pause, then the part my uncle hadn't prepared for. Furthermore, by initiating this contest and failing, the petitioner triggers the no contest clause. Another pause, this one longer, meaning he forfeits any entitlement to the estate of the deceased. For a moment, my uncle didn't respond, not immediately, not emotionally, like his mind was still waiting for an alternate version of the sentence, one where it ended differently, but it didn't. The gavel struck, not loudly, just decisively, and that was it. Not just the end of the case, the end of what he thought was already his. Outside the courthouse, the air felt unchanged, but nothing else was. My uncle walked past me without speaking. For the first time since everything began, he wasn't trying to win anything. He was trying to understand where the assumption had failed. A week later, I went back to the house. The front gate still stuck. The hallway still smelled faintly of lavender, but now there was a new silence inside it. Not absence. Resolution. In the kitchen drawer, the notebook was still there. I opened it again. One final entry was written on the last page. I hadn't noticed before. In Grandma's handwriting. Simple. Clear. No decoration. I did not leave confusion behind. I left documentation. That was when I understood what she had really done. She didn't try to punish anyone. She didn't need to. She simply made sure that every action would reveal its own intention. And when my uncle chose to challenge her will, he didn't lose because the system was harsh. He lost because every outcome had already been accounted for. Months later, I began restoring the house, not as an inheritance, but as a responsibility. I didn't change much at first, just repaired what time had worn down. The same door hinge, the same windows, the same quiet structure she had lived in while observing everyone else. Sometimes, when the house is still enough, it almost feels like she's still there, not watching, just satisfied that nothing she planned was wasted. And every time I think about my uncle now, I don't think about anger. I think about that moment in the courtroom when the judge finished speaking, because that was the moment he finally understood something Grandma had known all along. Some people don't need to fight to win. They only need to make sure the truth is impossible to avoid, and in the end, that was exactly what she left behind.